Well, hello there, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Transfer Talk podcast. Yes, I'm back. It's Pete Graves.
Whatever was said, whatever what did mean it. Peter Graves is back for good. Peter's back. Peter's back. Peter's back for good. Wherever I'm wrong, just tell me what song and we'll sing it. Peter Graves is back for good. Peter's back. Peter's back. Peter's back for good.
I am.
Hello, Peter.
I'm not actually. I'm going to Spain in 3 weeks. I'm only joking.
All right.
I'm not actually joking. But I am back. Good to see you, Doms. You all right?
Yeah, not bad.
Fantastic.
Not bad.
See, I love that. That's a great song, that, isn't it?
It is.
Classic.
Yeah.
And with us today, our special guest for the show, delighted to welcome Evening Standard's chief football correspondent, who joins us live from Wales, Dan Kilpatrick. Dan, nice to see you. How are you?
I'm blown away by kind of Geordie Backstreet Boys there.
Just take that.
I'm great. I'm great.
It was so bad he thought it was the Backstreet Boys.
Take that. Back for good.
Take that.
You know what?
That's my bad call. What a start.
No, but you know
that's
what?
the kind of insight I'll be bringing to this podcast.
You know what, Dan? I like you even more. The fact that you don't know your boy bands. That's actually credit to you, mate. So if that was an accidental slip or a purposeful one, that is credit to you. Well played, sir. Well played. Loads to talk about. Look, I mean, I've just got back from 3 weeks in Florida. I've got to be honest, Dan, right? And Dom's said to me, "Did you listen to the podcast when you were on holiday?" Dan, you'll sort of half understand this. I've got 3 kids, right? 12, 10 and 5. I planned to listen to the podcast when I was on holiday. In fact, I took my headphones. That was a stupid idea. Not one earphone went into my ears on that holiday. I didn't read one line of any book. I basically looked after 3 kids for 3 weeks because I don't know I think because I work in London and my family live in Newcastle. When we go on holiday, they've got zero interest in their mum, which is great for her. She laps it up. She sat on the sun lounger, sunning herself. I was literally had an entourage of 3 children for 3 weeks, and it was either throwing one in the pool, hitting the table tennis ball back to my son, and then watching my daughter do gymnastics. So I didn't have a break. So I missed the podcast, mate, but I'm sure they were brilliant when I was away. I'm sure I'd love to think I was missed, but probably wasn't, was I?
No, you were.
Oh, was
you
I?
were. Sam Ty, though. Myself and Sam Ty
Yeah,
had a bit of a bromance, so you got a bit of competition there.
Yeah, understand it. He's a very handsome man. Well, you both are. And Dan, you've been covering the Euros. I mean, that must have been great. I mean, other than the final, how was that experience?
Yeah, it was a great experience. I was covering England the whole time. Obviously, I wanted a different ending. I really just wanted Southgate to shut everyone up, to be honest. I'm a big Southgate fan. I mean, I know he's got his limitations, and England definitely didn't deserve to win that tournament. They didn't deserve to beat Spain, but I really wanted him to have his crowning moment and just kind of silence the doubters, because I think he felt the criticism and the divisive kind of nature of his position more than ever in Germany. But it was a great story, you know, England pulling it out of the bag every game, and I think it was just one game too far, really, wasn't it?
Oh, it was gut wrenching, wasn't it? I was meant to be in Florida for the quarterfinal, the semi-final, and the final, but my flight was delayed, so we were meant to be landing, and then just in time for the quarterfinal, and I'd squared it all off with Mrs. G. And I said, "Look, we'll land, we'll get our case out, and then we'll sit, and the first thing we'll do before anything else is we'll watch the game." Anyway, the flight was delayed, so I was up in the clouds when the quarterfinal was being played, and honestly, I made such a big deal of it going. In the end, the pilot said, "I know there's a couple of you out there really asking." So the pilot kept us up to date with the score. So the pilot was. So I was experiencing a penalty shootout with updates from the pilot, which was unbelievable, right? So and the whole plane was like celebrating when we went on penalties, even though I hadn't seen any of it. It's the first England game I've not watched since I was 8 years old.
No.
Honestly. And I was up in the clouds. So I was a bit gutted about that, but obviously we're through. Semi-final, I watched at a great bar in Florida, and it was packed with England fans. The atmosphere was brilliant. But then I've got to be honest, for the final, I got recommended to go to this sports bar, and I just picked the wrong one, guys, because I went to a sports bar. It was full of Scottish fans. wearing Spain shirts.
Oh, no.
And I'd say it was 70% Scottish fans and 30% English fans. And the Scottish fans celebrated that Spain goal like they just won the tournament. And the England fans then started getting a bit choppy. And I said to my wife and kids, I said, we're leaving. And we just literally walked out the door and took ourselves away from it. But I'm totally with you, Dan. I really wanted Gareth Southgate to win that tournament, for him. But I think he goes with his head held high. What an incredible record he's got. Semi-finals, finals and quarterfinals. Incredible record. And I think we'll only really appreciate how good he was maybe in years to come. But we're not here to talk about England. Those wounds are healed. We're here to talk about transfers. Where do we start? I mean, there's a lot been going on. It's starting to heat up a little bit. Doms, I'll come to you first with one which caught my eye. Looks like a great signing, is Fulham and Emile Smith-Rowe. Where are we with that one?
Yeah, depending on what time and what day you listen to this podcast, he could be officially announced as a Fulham player because the medical's done. Now we're expecting a formal announcement very soon. It is a club record for Fulham. It's an initial £27 million plus £7 million in performance-related add-ons. So total fee could be worth £34 million, which would exceed anything they've ever spent before. As far as Emile Smith-Rowe goes, I don't think Arsenal fans, they're a little bit sad about it. Or they don't want him to go. He's one of their own. Came through the academy, of course. Don't know whether they can sing the Saka Emile Smith-Rowe song anymore either, which has always been a favourite of theirs. But his primary motivation's always been first-team football. And he's just been a bit unlucky because the injuries that he's had, and when he's come back, he's had players like Martin Odegaard in his way. And the pathway to regular first-team football at Arsenal, while Odegaard is there, is going to be blocked. So I think it's probably a good move for everyone, really. Arsenal get good money. It's pure profit. Fulham get a good player. And Emile Smith-Rowe, you would think, primary motivation has been first-team football. He'll get that at Craven Cottage.
It was a strange one for Emile Smith-Rowe. Just 3 starts last season, Dan. I mean, a player that you could see has got immense quality. But do you agree with Darmish? Is this a good one for a good move for all the parties involved? Great signing for Fulham. Good move for Emile Smith-Rowe. He's staying in London. He's going to get first-team football. Presumably, he'd be a key player there, and a good move for Arsenal as well.
Yeah, I think so. Like as touched on there, all clubs in the Premier League now are looking for sellable assets, and they're particularly looking for sellable assets from their academy because, as you said, they count as pure profit. So in this era of profit and sustainability rules, I think it's a great deal for Arsenal. He's not a player who was really troubling the first team last season as much as he's loved at the club. And it's a great move for Fulham. I think it's easy to forget that Smith-Rowe was on the verge of the England team, a couple of years ago. I remember being in San Marino for that 10-0 win. And I think he came off the bench and scored his first England goal in that game. And he'd made his debut a few days earlier against Albania, I think it was. So he was really flying at that point. And then he got this injury, had groin surgery in September 2022. And it was just at the worst possible time, just as Arsenal were kind of clicking as a real force in the Premier League and mounting that first title challenge. And he never really got back in the side from there. He had a couple of other injuries as well, which derailed him at bad times. So I think he needs to go away and play. It's a great move for Fulham. They get a player who could potentially be, again, troubling the England squad if he gets back to his level. Arguably, Smith-Rowe could have, with the greatest respect to Fulham, aimed even higher. Looked at a kind of Villa or Newcastle type club. But I think, as you said, he just wants to go and get first team football and get back to where he was.
And Fulham busy, Doms, because they're looking at Scott McTominay as well. Is that a possibility?
This is a long-standing interest, actually. They bid for him earlier on in this transfer window, around £17 million. That was rejected out of hand by Manchester United. But we think that once the Emile Smith-Rowe deal is finalised, we're expecting, and I think Manchester United are expecting as well, Fulham to go back in with an improved offer from McTominay. Galatasaray are also interested. I'm told that they are both live. Galatasaray and Fulham, both of them want to sign Scott McTominay. If you look back to last summer, United were actually willing to sell him. They'd agreed a deal, I think, more or less with West Ham United. And in the end, that one didn't go through. He ended up becoming quite important in what was a really difficult season for United last season, scoring 10 goals for United. And Erik ten Hag has since said he's an important player. He's part of the squad, but stop short of saying, he's not for sale, because I think if a good enough offer was to come in, I think Manchester United would consider it. I think it's going to be all about budget and squad space. That's going to be the theme for the rest of the window for United, because they've got target in certain positions. Midfield is one of those targets. I'm sure we'll talk about it later on in the podcast, but to create the squad space, you're going to need to sell a player, and McTominay could bring them good money for them to be able to reinvest somewhere. So it's definitely one to watch, this one. Galatasaray interested, Fulham really interested. We think Fulham will go back in.
Okay, that's fascinating. I'll come back to you on McTominay in a second, Dobbs. I just want to ask you, Dan. I mean, we know Fulham have lost João Palhinha. I mean, someone like McTominay coming in after Emile Smith-Rowe, I mean, Fulham fans are going to be feeling pretty happy about if they can sign those two players. They'll be disappointed to lose Palhinha, of course, but in Smith-Rowe and McTominay, they've got a couple of proven Premier League players coming in, potentially. What's your take on the McTominay talk?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's another quite interesting deal for Fulham. I mean, obviously, they're looking at players at Big Six clubs, Arsenal and Manchester United, who are expendable, who those clubs are willing to sell and who aren't getting in the first team anymore. And I think that's a canny way to do their business, because you get kind of proven players who know the league, have a point to make, and we'll be hungry to do well. I do think Palhinha is a huge loss, that they're losing one of the best kind of holding midfielders in Europe. He's a player who kind of loves to destroy, sit in front of the back four, make tackles. He always seems to be getting booked whenever I watch Fulham play. And Scott McTominay isn't like for like. He's more of I actually think of him more as a goal scorer now, because he kept popping up with such important goals for United last season. I think he got 7 in the Premier League in 18 or 19 starts. So he's a real threat in the box. But he can sit if Fulham need him to. But they're going to have a kind of more open midfield if he comes in for Palhinha, that's for sure.
Yeah, you're right. He knows where the back of the net is. The Manchester United fans, you'd think, would be probably disappointed to lose him. But like you've both made the point, football these days seems to be about selling players you don't want to sell. Simple as that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, Ten Hag has publicly said that he's an important player. But publicly, you're going to have to say that. Because if you say anything else, what could that do to a potential value of a player? Because a buying club will come in and say, well, you don't actually want him.
Yeah.
But they're actually publicly saying, no, we want to keep him. He's an important player. And he's out there on the tour. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens with McTominay for the rest of this tour. Is he going to continue getting first team action and minutes? Or are they are they expecting this bid to come in sooner rather than later, and then maybe say, you know what, just sit out for a minute because we just need to sort this stuff that's going on in the background. Be interesting to see what happens.
We'll keep a close eye on it, that's for sure.
And with respect to kind of Galatasaray and the Turkish league, it doesn't really feel like he should be going there, does it? It feels like you go there at kind of 31, and I think he's 27. He's still doing well in the Premier League. I can't really see him going to Galatasaray. I think he should stick in a top European league. Yeah,
fair point, mate. Let's talk about Chelsea, because one transfer that has caught our eye, and we've been reporting this on Sky Sports News, and Dons, you've been across it as well as other reporters, is their interest in Victor Osimhen, someone we've talked about time and time again on this podcast, and this idea that Osimhen comes in and Romelu Lukaku, who's still a Chelsea player, by the way, if you weren't aware, goes to Napoli in the other direction. We'll come to you in a second, Doms, but Dan, I'll start with you. I mean, Osimhen to Chelsea, that's a really mouth-watering prospect, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on it there, but I feel like he's been linked to Chelsea forever. He's kind of one of those players that's either going to go there this summer or he's never going to go there and just carry on being linked with them perennially. But yeah, I mean, he's definitely an exciting prospect. I mean, you look at what he's done in Italy for Napoli. He's been a lethal goal scorer, particularly in that title-winning season for them. He's got a great record for his country as well, for Nigeria. He just knows where the back of the net is. I have to say, I think Nicholas Jackson's, I know he's a kind of butt of jokes, but I think he actually had quite a decent season. He kind of grew into the Premier League a bit. So, I do wonder whether... whether he's had a bit of a raw deal in terms of the way he's perceived. He's still a young player. But look, if Chelsea can send Lukaku the other way, and obviously they've been trying to get rid of Lukaku for a while now, and get Osimhen, then it would obviously be a really canny bit of business for them, and immediately improve their squad and solve a couple of major problems. So yeah, it feels like a no-brainer to me on paper.
Yeah, Pete, Dan says if, because it's all well and good us talking about this potential deal and it looks like it could work for everyone. It's a really, really complicated one to do. If you go back to last summer, they've tied down Osimhen, Napoli did, to a new contract, but with a release clause, but on massive money. And they thought they'd only be paying that money for one season because they thought, right, someone will come in, meet his release clause, and he'll be gone next summer. And we'll have those wages off the books, and we'll have a big transfer fee as well. However, it's not as easy as that, because we know financial situations of every club in European football is not easy. They've got to comply with various PSR rules for one. So what they're trying to do here is Napoli buy Romelu Lukaku. We know who the Napoli manager is. It's Antonio Conte. He loves Romelu Lukaku. Romelu Lukaku played under Conte when Inter Milan won the Serie A title back in 2021, and he was fantastic for them that season, was Lukaku. So he would go on a permanent deal. Ideal scenario would be Napoli would sell Osimhen on a permanent deal to Chelsea. I don't know whether that's feasible given the amount of money that's involved. So what Napoli need to do is have some sort of guarantee that that deal will become permanent at some stage. So it can't be a loan with an option. A loan with an obligation is something that they are now discussing. Because the issue that Napoli have got is they can't be in a scenario where they buy Romelu Lukaku, so spend the money on him with his wages, and then have the risk of Osimhen having a one-season loan and then coming back to Napoli on the wages that he's on. It just simply cannot be sustainable for Napoli to do that. As I said, there's still lots of work to do on this deal. So Napoli will be looking for a permanent aspect for Osimhen in this whole exchange, if you like, even though it might not be painted as a swap deal, because I don't think either party would be wanting to be part of something that's this, oh, we'll just chuck him in and you can bring, footballers got egos, their representatives have got egos as well. And it's like, well, this is Victor Osimhen we're talking about, this is Romelu Lukaku we're talking about. But they are talking. So the fact that they're talking may suggest that there's a possibility that this deal, however ambitious it is, can get done.
If it was a swap deal, that would have to be the highest profile swap deal of all time. I was trying to think of what Arsenal and Manchester United when they did
Mkhitaryan
and Sanchez was pretty high profile, but Osimhen for Lukaku is like what? Dan Enzo Maresca said his players are confused by his style of play at the moment, but does he need to work with the club's recruitment team to ensure that they're getting the right type of players in that suit his style, or is he going to have to bend a little bit? I mean, managers don't tend to. What do you think of the start he's made, even though it's only been brief?
Yeah, well, it's always important for the club to sign players that suit the manager's style of play, and with Chelsea, I feel like that's always a bit of a question mark, isn't it? Because their approach under the new owners just seems to be flood the squad with the best young talents on the market and then kind of let the manager work it out from there. And it hasn't worked well for Graham Potter or necessarily Mauricio Pochettino. And I do think one of the problems Pochettino had, particularly at the beginning, was that there were players in the squad, very expensive players, Enzo Fernandez for one, for me, who just didn't really feel like Poch players and suit his style of play. And that's an issue they've had, and that's one Maresca is going to have to overcome. They are going to keep doing the same thing, I think. Their approach is very much, they want to keep signing the best young players in the world, and kind of building this hugely high potential side and letting the manager sort of work it out. And they're going to have to, he's going to have to try and do that. I think, I haven't seen a huge amount of them on tour, but I think, there have been glimpses of what he's trying to do. I think Chelsea fans are excited by his possession game. We saw how well that worked at Leicester in the Championship, but the big question is, whether that can translate to the Premier League, because he's never managed a top flight game. And that opening game, it's against Man City, isn't it? It's going to be his first taste of a big 5 European league, and that's a huge ask for him.
Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating watch, Chelsea, the early part of the season. But sticking with them, I mean, Conor Gallagher's a player, and we've already mentioned about players from the academy being sold on for pure profit, but he's a player that's been continually linked with a move away from Chelsea. And Dom's Atletico Madrid has been mentioned, Spurs, we know, a long-time admirers as well. Where is that currently?
Yeah, so we know there was a massive gap in valuation actually between what Atletico Madrid were prepared to pay and what Chelsea wanted for Conor Gallagher. But talks have now resumed, and while there's no agreement at the moment, we think that there's a compromise maybe that could be reached between the two clubs. The mere fact that talks are ongoing between Atletico Madrid and Chelsea would suggest that both clubs believe that a deal can be done here. He's into the final year of his deal, is Conor Gallagher. So he holds quite a lot of the cards here. And you mentioned him being an academy product. It would represent pure profit for Chelsea. So I don't know whether Chelsea fans will be too enamoured with a potential departure for Conor Gallagher. I don't know whether Chelsea themselves would actually want to sell Conor Gallagher. I just think they're in a position now where you're in a sell or renew stage. They don't want to let him run down his contract and leave for no money at all, because you're potentially losing 30 to 40 million pounds for him. But Atletico Madrid definitely want to sign him. It's just whether they can reach that compromise with Chelsea on the price. And then you've got all the issues with personal terms, which we understand haven't been finalised at all yet. There's also the possibility that Premier League clubs will be interested in Conor Gallagher. We think that Chelsea are expecting Tottenham, who you mentioned long-term admirers, to come in again for Conor Gallagher. They tried to sign him, I think, deadline day last summer. And in the end, Chelsea said no. We'll take our chances. He's got 2 years left on his contract. We'll revisit it again next summer. And he ended up being captain for a lot of the season at Chelsea last season, which is probably why the Chelsea fans are thinking sometimes what is going on with some of our purchases and our sales. But it's definitely a live one, and Atletico Madrid definitely want him.
Dan, what are your thoughts? I mean, Spurs, Gallagher to Spurs, could you see that one happening?
I mean, my understanding with Spurs' interest in Gallagher was that it was always more likely a deal was always more likely before the PSR deadline, so before June 30th, because in that scenario, Spurs kind of held the aces and Chelsea were under pressure to sell. Now that deadline's passed, I think Chelsea, notwithstanding his contract situation, which is obviously difficult for them, can be a bit more bullish on price. Look, I think he is a player that would fit Postecoglou's system pretty well. I mean, he's probably the best presser in the Premier League from that midfield role. We saw Gareth Southgate in the summer at the Euros, turning to him after a couple of games because he felt England weren't pressing well enough. And that's what Gallagher can bring to a side, really good energy in the middle. And Postecoglou likes that. But Spurs have signed Archie Gray. Lucas Bergvall's joined the club this summer. They've got a really promising young midfielder called Alfie Devine, who's played a lot in pre-season. And I just question now whether they really need Conor Gallagher. I mean, I don't think he's going to immediately improve their best 11. He would be a good squad player, but there are lots of kind of promising young players jostling to be squad players for Spurs now. And I'll question whether they need to spend 40 million or so, on that position when there are other positions they need to strengthen. I think one issue for Spurs that we might get onto later in the pod is their kind of homegrown issue. They do have a problem there. They need to sign kind of English players for European football next season. So maybe that's part of their interest in Gallagher.
Well, if they want homegrown players, I mean, Chelsea, the team to call on it, because Chelsea loves selling a homegrown. I mean, something we've talked about a lot before. I mean, the likes of Conor Gallagher, Chelsea trying to sell him, but they've already sold. I mean, Lewis Hall's signed now for Newcastle on a permanent this window. You've seen Ian Maatsen go to Villa. I mean, just what are your thoughts on it, Dan? Generally, this whole idea, Newcastle United sold Elliot Anderson to Nottingham Forest. The fans loved him, such a highly rated player, came through the academy there, but they had to sell him for PSR reasons. It's like something doesn't sit right with me. What are your thoughts on it all, Dan?
Yeah, I completely agree. It doesn't sit right at all, and I think Chelsea fans will feel as though they're kind of losing something from the club. A sense of identity, a sense of kind of belonging, that connection with the fan base and community. You lose that when you sell these types of players. I think we should say that this policy predates the current ownership. I mean, under Abramovich, they sold Mark Gay, Fikayo Tomori, Tammy Abraham, all players who would probably be getting in their squad, if not first team at the moment. So this has been a Chelsea policy for a while because they have such a good academy at Cobham and they produce so many players. Obviously, some of them, like Reece James, are kind of still there, but a lot of them have now gone. And I think it's a great shame that the rules incentivize clubs to do this and get pure profit, because it means you're kind of losing players who you should really be building the team around, and kind of again have that connection with the local area and the fan base. It's probably worth saying that Chelsea have been massive beneficiaries of Manchester City doing this as well, of course, because they sold Cole Palmer to raise pure profit, and he's been a revelation at Chelsea. So I guess it can work both ways, but I don't think it's a good trend for the game overall.
I totally agree with you. Well said, Dan. I totally agree. Dom's just on Chelsea incomings. They have announced the signing of a goalkeeper, Philip Jorgensen, or Jorgensen was what my co-presenter Alex Aljo suggested it would be when we talked about the pronunciation. So whether it's Jorgensen or Jorgensen, or Jorgensen even, what do we know about this keeper? Much?
Yeah, Denmark under-21 international, and I think it's one that Enzo Maresca wanted to bring in because he's obviously got a style of play. They've gone through, scoured Europe and to see who would fit the profile of keeper that Chelsea would want, and they've settled on Philip Jorgensen, and he's come from Villarreal. I was a regular with Villarreal last season. I think they finished 8th in the end last season. And he signed a 7-year contract, as is the way with Chelsea. It'd be interesting to see because we think Robert Sanchez will probably start as number 1. But if Jorgensen has been brought in because he fits the profile that Maresca wants, he'll no doubt be competing very hard for that number 1 shirt. And, it'll be interesting to see how long it takes before Maresca decides, actually, do you know what? You're number 1 now. It might even happen next season.
I want to discuss West Ham next. It's been busy for them over the last few windows with a new structure in place, and they're starting to assemble a really impressive squad. And looking at a couple of big name arrivals still to add to the squad, Darmesh. I'll start with Manchester United defender Aaron Wan-Bissaka, and then you can go on to talk about Niclas Füllkrug as well, the striker. I mean, both look like good signings to me.
Yeah, they look like they're advancing, both of them. With regard to Aaron Wan-Bissaka, we're told that Manchester United and West Ham are close to an agreement now over the sale of Wan-Bissaka to West Ham United. Lots of aspects, I'm told, of the deal have been agreed. However, there's still work to do, including finalising the fee and how that fee is going to be paid, so the structure of payments. As it stands, though, it looks like it's heading towards a positive conclusion whereby Wan-Bissaka will go from Manchester United to West Ham. He'll obviously, of course, have to finalise his personal terms and have a medical and all of that kind of thing as well, but still work to do between the clubs. The other one you mentioned, Niclas Füllkrug. This is an interesting one because it kind of came out of, I wouldn't say out of nowhere, because I think Tim Stuyton was interested in signing him when he was at Werder Bremen last summer, and he ended up going to Borussia Dortmund. So he spent a season at Borussia Dortmund. He's now 31 years of age, German international, scored, of course, during Euro 2024 for Germany. He's got 2 years left on his contract. We're told that talks are advancing between West Ham United and Borussia Dortmund over this signing. Cautious optimism is the phrase that I've been told, that a deal can be done for Niclas Füllkrug to swap Borussia Dortmund for West Ham United. You remember that West Ham, their primary target throughout the window was John Duran, but they simply haven't been able to agree a deal with Aston Villa for John Duran. It's proved too expensive. So rather than just try and focus on that, they've looked at alternative targets, and Füllkrug is one that they've done due diligence on previously anyway, because as I mentioned, they tried to sign him last summer. It looks like it could be the summer where he could arrive at the London Stadium.
Interesting. I mean, Dan, when you look at the work that West Ham have done recently, I mean, with the likes of Wan-Bissaka and Füllkrug edging closer to a move there, and you add to that the 65 million they've already spent on Lewis Guillem and Max Kilman as well. And then you look at the previous winners, likes of Kudus, Alvarez, Ward-Prowse, could go on and on. How impressed have you been with the work there at the London Stadium? And I guess technical director as well, Tim Steidten.
Yeah, I think Steidten's doing a really encouraging job. I mean, they're signing players that kind of arguably bigger clubs are often linked with, and they're making a huge impact. I mean, Kudus was a revelation last season in the Premier League. I absolutely loved watching him, and I think Steidten is doing a lot of work behind the scenes as well. I know that he's really modernising their kind of scouting and data department. I think it's encouraging for him and West Ham that he's kind of got his own man in the dugout now. Him and David Moyes didn't always see eye to eye, which is kind of understandable. Moyes, perhaps a slightly different kind of operator. So yeah, I think the signs are good, and West Ham are in a kind of healthy position. They've got a big stadium. They didn't have to kind of get in a huge amount of debt for it, so they're able to kind of reap the rewards of that, and they've obviously been in Europe for a few years, so financially, they're able to kind of throw their weight around a little bit, and I think it's showing, and they're looking upwardly mobile.
And they are a team that needs a new striker, aren't they? I mean, you would think that's the one position which you would think would be key for them in this window. So no surprise to see them go in for someone with the stature of Füllkrug.
Yeah, I mean, he's a sort of stature in more ways than one, I suppose. I mean, he was the kind of one of many big men at the Euros that were kind of coming off the bench and making an impact. I really enjoyed watching him, actually. He scored a couple of cracking goals, I thought. West Ham's sort of history, or recent history of signing strikers has been catastrophic. I mean, Scamacca obviously being the latest one, but they seem to have tried to sign sort of so many players that just haven't really worked in the Premier League or at the club for whatever reason. So it does feel like they need to get one right, or they're bound to get one right sooner or later. I really like Antonio as a player, but I do think they need to move on from him. He's got his limitations, and he struggles to stay fit. Bowen's done a great job through the middle for them, but he's a winger really, and they probably want him out wide, cutting inside, and that's where he's most dangerous. So it's a big position for them to get right this summer. Füllkrug would be really interesting. He obviously feels in many ways like a player who'd be well suited to the Premier League. He wouldn't have any problems kind of with the physical element of it, the pace of it. So yeah, I think that would be a really intriguing signing if it happens.
Great stuff. We'll keep an eye on that. West Ham still busy, it would seem. As are Manchester United. As always, plenty of rumours and discussion over comings and goings at Old Trafford. And speaking this week, Erik ten Hag was claiming that the club are still hoping to bring in more players. Dharmesh, you're never far away from the action there at Old Trafford. What's happening at the moment?
This is linked, first of all, to the Aaron Wan-Bissaka deal. But just generally, I would say for the remainder of this transfer window, it's all about creating finances and creating squad space. I mentioned that before with Scott McTominay. United will have targets in various positions, but they will need to sell in those positions to create the money and to create the squad space as well. So now we've got a situation, if you look at the right back area, we've talked about Aaron Wan-Bissaka potentially close to going to West Ham United. Well, while they're doing that, unlike previous windows when maybe Manchester United would then act reactively, they're very proactive in this transfer window so far. So they've effectively agreed in principle a deal with Bayern Munich for their right back, Nusem Mazraoui, who, coincidentally, West Ham United had agreed a deal with Bayern Munich over last week. But that fell through and they went back to Aaron Wan-Bissaka, much to Manchester United's relief, because United were interested in Mazraoui. That one now looks like it's done, but it will accelerate once the Aaron Wan-Bissaka deal is done. So Manchester United it's almost like a holding pattern just now. They've sorted everything out more or less with the player and with the club over Mazraoui. They're now just waiting for Aaron Wan-Bissaka to sort out his deal to West Ham.
And Matthias de Ligt?
Yeah, again, this will be a situation where Manchester United will probably have to sell in the central defensive area if they are going to go back in for another centre-back. Interestingly, the representative of Matthijs de Ligt is the same representative as Nusayr Mazraoui. And of course, they're from the same club. So I'm sure there will be continuing talks with Bayern Munich over de Ligt. The last we heard over this deal was, even though United can't actually go out and buy him now because of the squad space within Old Trafford at the moment, they do want to try and sort out a deal in case one of their players leaves. Victor Lindelof is key to this probably. If he was to leave, United will probably go back into the market, but not at the price that Bayern Munich would want. Now, I just wonder now whether everyone's playing a game of poker here, because you've got Lenny Euro, who suffered an injury for Manchester United. Are Bayern Munich looking at that and thinking, oh, maybe we can stand firm with the price for de Ligt, because they might be a little bit desperate to bring in a centre-back? On the flip side, Manchester United know that Bayern Munich are desperate to do a deal with Bayer Leverkusen for Jonathan Tah. But they can't do the deal with Jonathan Tah until they sell Matthijs de Ligt. So I think at some point, if potential sales can happen, both these clubs are going to have to come together and there'll be a compromise. It won't be as much as what Bayern want to pay, and it won't be as little as what United want to pay. But that's transfers.
Bearing in mind that, Erik ten Hag said the whole squad was up for sale. Words to that effect was one of the headlines in the papers. Whether he said it or not, whether it was lost in translation. But we've talked about Wan-Bissaka, we've talked about Scott McTominay. Do you think there'd be many more departures? Because clearly there was talk of a major overhaul, particularly since the sort of half takeover of the club from Sir Jim Ratcliffe.
I don't think it's that far away. There are a few untouchables, you'd say, at United that they just wouldn't consider offers for. But if you've got big enough offers, like I've mentioned Lindelof, but he's into the final year of his contract. I've mentioned McTominay. As much as publicly they don't want to sell him, there's a chance that if they get a good enough deal, then they can go into the market and maybe accelerated deal for Uarte maybe, or they're interested in Yusuf Fofana as well. Sofian Amrabat is still on the table as well. Jadon Sancho is an interesting one. We do know that everyone's made up. They've drawn a line under all of their problems of Erik ten Hag and Jadon Sancho, but PSG are interested. They haven't had a club-to-club approach or a formal bid as yet, but if they did come in with something that United were thinking, we probably can't refuse this, I don't think you can rule out Jadon Sancho leaving Manchester United in this transfer window still, despite everything that's happened and him being reintegrated into first team training. So I think there's still going to be a lot of movement at United. There's still the best part of a month to go in this transfer window. They will need to make sales though if they want to fill those areas and pursue deals with players that they've done work on already.
Interesting. Right. Well, look, I want to bring Dan back in. So there's likely to be plenty more deals at Old Trafford. But Dan, you cover Spurs on a weekly basis. So let's talk about Spurs. Are you surprised so far with the sort of lack of fuss over transfers so far at the club? Because, Postecoglou, another one who you thought was probably eyeing up a bit of an overhaul this summer.
Yeah, I'm a little bit surprised because Postecoglou made it very clear toward the back end of the season, last season, that this was a big summer for the club. He talked a lot about change. There was a press conference where he said, we need to change several times. And I think, we all thought that meant there was going to be a big overhaul this summer, but it's been a little bit slow so far. I think the Euros and Copa America are part of that. That generally slows down the summer market because clubs kind of wait till they're over before making their big moves. And we have seen Spurs start to kind of clear the decks, I think, and that was always a big priority for them as well. They need to get players out before they can get them in, and we've seen them release and Ndombele and Ryan Sessegnon and be quite ruthless there. And I think they're working on exits for Emerson Royale and a couple of others as well. So they are kind of clearing space to make moves later in the window. But I've been a little bit surprised, albeit I know we'll come on to their signings, but I've been encouraged by kind of the type of moves that they've made so far.
And there seems to be a bit of a momentum shift at Spurs, doesn't it? The deals that they're doing, Archie Gray from Leeds, for example, he's a young player with a big future as opposed to maybe a tried and trusted Premier League player or someone with a bigger reputation, which is what we've sort of grown accustomed to in recent years with Spurs.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's a little bit surprising because Postecoglou said again last season that he expects to be challenging for the title this term. That's the aim. He's had his foundation year, and now it's about kind of kicking on and trying to win stuff. But the signing Spurs make suggests that their strategy is more about maybe waiting for Guardiola to leave Man City at the end of the season and perhaps being ready to kind of kick on in a year's time. But look, on Gray, I have to say, this is exactly the kind of signing that I think usually works well for Spurs. If you look back at their history, when they sign the best young players for the Championship, it generally kind of coincides with the club going up a level. I mean, back when they signed, Carrick and Defoe and Paul Robinson and Michael Dawson, that coincided with Spurs kind of kicking on and becoming relevant in the Premier League under Martin Jol. And then obviously they signed Bale, and that coincided with them kicking on and becoming relevant in Europe. And then Pochettino's team had Dele Alli signed from the Football League and Kyle Walker. So these signings have tended to do well for Spurs. There is a risk, for every Aaron Lennon, there's a kind of Wayne Routledge, and for every Kyle Walker, there's a Carl Norton. So Gray isn't a sure thing, but he's a hugely exciting young player from the Championship, and I think there's enough evidence to suggest that he'll slot right in and be a really good addition for Spurs.
Do you think there's money there to spend, Dan?
Yeah, that's always the big question for Spurs. I mean, we know that they want more money to spend because Daniel Levy said he's looking for someone to buy a minority stake in the club. He said that at the end of last season, and that's so he can stay in charge, but Spurs can have more spending money to kind of kick on and try and match the big clubs. Under their current model, that they're always kind of limited, and they can only spend within their means. They can only spend what they earn, but they are one of the biggest earners in the Premier League now. So, there is stadium debt, but they should have some money to spend. I do think if they can clear the decks, if they get rid of a few more unwanted players, Brian Hill, Sergio Reguilon, Emerson Royale, maybe a couple of others, possibly Richarlison, then you'll see Spurs maybe go into the market for a striker at the end of the window and maybe spend some serious money.
Great stuff, Dan. We're going to move from Spurs and come to Arsenal in a second, but I kind of just wanted to crowbar a bit in Newcastle in here because it fits nicely off the back of Spurs, because Spurs have been quiet, and I think the fans are probably looking at it thinking, when are we? And I've seen, you look on social media and you can see the Spurs fans asking the questions constantly to the likes of Dan and you, Doms, about the likes of Eber Eze and all these sort of players, and are we going to sign this player? And I think there's a little bit of that from Newcastle fans as well. Every time I open up my X account, I've got people asking me why Newcastle aren't doing any business. But I think it's interesting. You made a point really early, Doms, about the number of players in your squad and being able to move players out. Newcastle have signed really well since the takeover, but there's a lot of players in the Newcastle squad that I feel they simply haven't been able to sell, and they're kind of stuck with them in a way. If you look at Newcastle next season, 2025, because I'm just picking up on what you said, Dan, as well about Pep Guardiola and having one more year. I just wonder next summer, and I know we're a year away, but most of Newcastle's squad are out of contract next summer. Newcastle have got so many players that have got 1 year left. They're all in. If you write a list of the players that are going into their last year, they're all there in Newcastle. You name it, Callum Wilson's, your Kieran Trippier's, your Martin de Bravo. There's a whole host of players.
You always have to do it in plural as well, don't you?
Yeah.
Your Trippiers.
Your Wilson. Yeah. They're all into their last year. And I just wonder whether Newcastle are thinking, we've got a few, they have got money to spend in this window, but I just wonder whether they're thinking, we've got players there who've probably can do a job this season. And that's why I mentioned Wilson and Trippier. They can definitely do a job this season. But next summer, do you keep your powder dry? We've learnt with PSR, clubs are getting themselves in a right state. Newcastle, I mentioned Elliot Anderson. They signed a player called Minte, which they'd scouted they plucked him from nowhere, sent him on loan for a season at Feyenoord. He'd done brilliant in the Champions League. They've sold him to Brighton for 30-odd million quid. He's never even pulled on the black and white shirt. But now Newcastle fans are absolutely doing their nuts in because he keeps scoring these wonder goals for Brighton. And they're like, oh my goodness me, he was our player. We've had to sell him. And he's going off and he just looks perfect for the Brighton system. He's going to be an unbelievable player. But because of PSR, Eddie Howe given the choice of, do you want to sell a player that you haven't had to integrate yet? And it worked brilliantly for Newcastle from that point of view, but it was so frustrating. So I just wonder whether Newcastle are just sitting tight and thinking, yeah, we might bring in one here, two there maybe, but the big window is next summer as well. So I think there will be clubs who are quiet, and I just would, at my point, following up from what Dan was saying about Spurs, is maybe don't panic because teams have got a plan, not just for this window, but for January and then for next summer and then even the following January. So I think there's planning going in place. Now more than ever, teams have to plan for upcoming windows. So the likes of Spurs, the likes of Newcastle, the like other teams that have been quiet, I just think fans need to maybe be a little bit patient and think, well, if they're not going to spend it now, then maybe planning to spend it in a future window. That would be my thoughts anyway. Arsenal, it's the final club we're going to cover this week because we are running out of time, but such an intriguing possibility as well that our colleagues in Sky Germany reporting that they're keeping an eye on Leroy Sané and his Bayern Munich contract talks, Darmish. I mean, we know all about Sané from his time at Manchester City. What do you think, Darms, as our transfer expert? Can you see this one happening? And what does it mean, when you hear a team are keeping an eye on contract talks? What does it mean?
Exactly that, because when a player of his ability is entering the final year of his contract, you'd be silly not to have an eye on that situation, particularly because the link is there with Arteta. Arteta worked with Leroy Sané when he was assistant to Pep Guardiola at Manchester City, and I think it was back in April when Leroy Sané did an interview and he spoke really highly of Mikel Arteta and how he was coached by Mikel Arteta and how he took on some of the advice and the skills that Arteta had passed on to him into his own game moving forward. So he's always eulogised about Mikel Arteta, and I think a lot of people might be putting two and two together. Would there be an interest? If he was available, I think there probably would be an interest from Arsenal. But as Sky Germany are reporting, keeping an eye on the situation is simply that. They are also saying that they're not expecting Sané to leave Bayern Munich. They do expect him to stay and sign a new contract. So this will all be a moot point anyway, but it's good for the chat because it would be silly for Arsenal and another club who would be interested in a player of his ability not to just have half an eye on what's going on at Bayern Munich and his contract.
Dan, Arsenal, the closest side to challenging Manchester City. We've seen that the last 2 years. Do you expect to see someone with the stature? I've used that word stature again, but sort of the profile of Sané coming to Arsenal. And do you think they're going to add maybe a marquee signing or two just to try and pip City to the title this year around?
Well, they haven't been shy about making big signings in the last few years, have they? I mean, they've splashed the cash on Rice and Havertz and others. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, I think I can't see it being Sané personally, just because he predominantly plays on the right, and that's obviously a position that's completely locked down by Saka. Sané can play on the left, but he's more comfortable over on the other side. I do wonder though. Arteta's been so ruthless at upgrading the first team. Even more ruthless than many fans would have wanted at times. They were very happy with Aaron Ramsdale, but Arteta wasn't having it. And I look at their team now, and it's hard to kind of find a place where they could improve. But I wonder about the left wing and Martinelli. And he's obviously a great player, but could they go and really spend some serious money there and get a kind of another Saka on that side? Could it be Sané? I'm really not sure. But yeah, I think Arteta, being the way he is, being constantly striving for improvement, we'll be looking at ways to improve that side, and perhaps that's one area he'll be considering.
I think Dan makes a great point there, Pete, because it's very difficult when you look at Arsenal's first choice team, how much more you can improve that first team. are there going to be players who can come in and displace those players that are already there? And Arteta was asked in a news conference earlier on this week, I think it was, about potential signings. And he's thrown doubt on whether Arsenal would go out and spend another 100 million on a player, for example, like they did with Declan Rice last summer. It would be more on getting some of these players who are not going to be getting first team football out of the club, getting some money for those players. We're talking about Emile Smith-Rowe, we're talking about Reece Nelson, we're talking about Eddie Nketiah as well, and then reinforcing the squad. Maybe not reinforcing the actual first team, but reinforcing the squad, because what Arteta is constantly trying to do is narrow that gap between that first 11, 12, 13, 14 players and the rest. So the players that do come in, you're not seeing such a drop in quality. I think what happened a couple of seasons ago when you saw William Saliba get injured for a long part of that season, Rob Holding had to come in, and a lot of people directed that change as one of the reasons why Arsenal didn't fully challenge City towards the end of the season. Already what they've done, and people have said, why do they need to strengthen in that area? Ricardo Calafiori's come in. But that's Arteta. He's looking at marginal gains, as is Edu, and looking at areas that maybe the outsider like ourselves are thinking they don't need to strengthen that area. They're fine there. But now you've got a player in Calafiori, in Timber, in Ben White, who can all play fullback, who can all play central defence, who can all do that role where you go from the fullback area into the midfield. And then you start thinking, oh, actually, it does. There is a bit of method behind this.
And do you see anyone else close it? Guys, last final one. I mean, City have been the title winners, haven't they, the last few years? Arsenal have pushed them closer. Anyone else you're going to tip to have a go at the title this season? You said, Dan, about Spurs, and I'm saying that this year he was going to go for the title. I mean, that seems a long way away from where I'm sitting. Can you see anyone? Chelsea or Manchester United or Liverpool or Villa or any Newcastle, anyone challenging Pep and his players?
It's always hard to sort of predict who's going to come from nowhere. I do think someone will be up there. I mean, Liverpool under Arne Slot are kind of an unknown quantity.
Yeah.
Similarly, Chelsea under Maresca. Postecoglou is very bullish about his capabilities. I know I cover Spurs generally, but I'm really interested to see how they do. I mean, I think he's got an element of the kind of Bielsa about him. I think Postecoglou, he's a bit of a genius, but is he going to be kind of flexible enough to make it work? I think that's the big question. As it stands, I still think Manchester City and Arsenal will be the top two, but I'm really intrigued to see kind of how the challengers get on.
Yeah, would you agree with that, Dan?
Yeah, I think so. Arsenal will be the biggest challengers. Now, they probably are spotting an opportunity here as well, because all we're hearing out of Manchester City at the moment is what's going to happen with De Bruyne, what's going to happen with Ederson, what's going to happen with Julian Alvarez. You're not hearing too much about how are they reinforcing, whereas Arsenal might see this as, well, 2 seasons ago we came really close, but it kind of petered away towards the end. Last season they took it to the very last game, so they closed the gap. This season they're probably looking at this transfer window and thinking this is an opportunity now. Calafiori has come in. If they can bring in another 1 or 2 players that would just give them that extra edge, that extra 2 points, which is probably what it is going to take. He's already said 114 is the magic number. 38 times 3 is 114, by the way, Pete. He says you have to be perfect. That's how they have to look at it. It's not going to take that. I can't imagine it will require a team to win all of their games. But you get the message he's trying to send here, that the challenge of Manchester City is so great that we've got to be near perfect. And he's trying to do that predominantly, first of all, in the transfer window, and then when the season starts.
I'll tell you who has been near perfect. You two guys, Dharmesh Sheth and Dan Kilpatrick from the Evening Standard. Guys, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure. Dan, thanks for coming on, mate. It's been lovely to see you again.
It's been a pleasure. Yeah, I'm just going to go and brush up on my boy band knowledge and listen to some Take That and Backstreet Boys.
Good man.
I know why you might have got confused, because
your singing sounds more...
Backstreet's Back, All Right.
Yeah.
There's a song
and
with back in the
and
title.
Won You Back for Good. You're right, that is
we'll let him off.
Yeah.
Let 'em off.
So Dan's looking cooler by the minute, and Dharmesh, you're looking less cool.
I don't care.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm owning it. I like boy bands.
I know you do, mate. I know you do.
I might.
Oh, we've got to get the Michael Jackson story. We'll save it.
I
Okay.
told you this
fine,
is this is
fine. Yeah.
late.
So we're gonna
Once
get
the
that.
window closed.
Well, we've still got over 4 weeks left of
Yes.
this transfer window till
Not that we're
deadline day.
counting.
Dan, great to see you. Enjoy your breakaway in Wales. Thanks for taking time out for coming and seeing us. And Dharmesh, as always, wonderful to see you. And to coin your phrase, I'm now going to peter away this podcast to the end. Literally, because I want to give a thank you to those of you at home who've been listening. It's been lovely to be back, and wherever you have listened to this podcast, whether you've been in your cars or on the train, in the wind or out in the rain,
In the sun at the
quite
minute,
nice,
yeah.
in your house or out in the shed, on your couch or maybe in your
In
bed,
the sunshine, yeah.
up on the hills or down in the valleys,
Yeah, one of those.
in the streets or in the alleys,
Those-
out for a run or maybe for a walk.
Both.
Thanks for listening to Transfer Talk.
And that's for sure.